Thank you so much, Moira, and thank you to the Africa America Institute and the State of Education Conference for having me. I'm happy to be here. Today, I will be talking about human survival and climate change and the lessons that we can infer from Africa's deep past. So, what I do, I perform two specialties. I perform faunal analysis, and that's a method of identifying and quantifying the species present in an archaeological assemblage, as well as the variable traits and attributes thereof. And I also am a zooarchaeologist, and this kind of describes what we do after the faunal analysis when we connect the results of our analysis to larger anthropological concepts. And we try to figure out what those results mean in terms of cultural practice and historical events and human behavior. So, today I'm going to tell you a very abbreviated story of Saharan pastoralism and climate change. And this story begins in the Holocene. So, when archaeologists such as myself discuss the deep history of human environment interactions, we have these two schema and their associated terms that we use to situate ourselves in time. So, we talk about geological epochs and we also talk about cultural periods. So, Pliocene, Pleistocene, Holocene, these are example of geological epochs. This is largely a descriptor of where we are in an ongoing sequence of climatic events known as geological time. As the Earth follows its trajectory around the sun, the regular changes in the angle of the Earth's tilt can lead to fluctuations in temperature. And these lead to changes in the size of the ice caps at the North and the South Pole. And when these polar glaciers are larger, sea levels around the world are lower, causing drier atmosphere across continents. When these polar glaciers are smaller, sea levels rise and moister air moves across continents. These periods are known as glacials and interglacials, and they can influence stark periodic changes in environmental conditions around the world. We also sometimes can use synonyms for these ages like ice age, etc., and this still refers to a geological epoch. So, in terms of geological time, there are some people who now argue that we're in the Anthropocene, meaning whereas before it was the position of the Earth combined with a host of other factors, including, carbon cycles, etc., used to be the primary driver of changes and fluctuation in climate. Now, the activities of Homo sapiens are the primary driver of climate change. This doesn't mean that we are the only cause of changing weather patterns, but it means that through greenhouse gases and the associated rising temperatures, we have hindered the rate of some of these ongoing cyclical processes while accelerating the speed and frequency of others. So, in this other schema, the one that describes cultural ages, you see terms like early Stone Age, Middle Stone Age, and later Stone Age. So these can also be called like Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic. And then we also have terms like Iron Age, Bronze Age. And these are example of like cultural periods in time, and they're based on tool making and strategies employed by human communities to accomplish their goals. And these terms tend to describe an overall suite of raw materials and finished products that differ from, you know, later periods or early periods. So, like Ice Age simply means that Iron Age simply means that this is an age in which people were dependent on iron, and which the use of iron spread quickly. People used it for weapons, tools, for farming, etc. So when we see a dominant material kind of rise in a cultural period, sometimes that dominant material to archaeologists takes on, kind of gives the name to that period. By that same logic, some people argue that we are now in the plastic age because of the material dominance that plastic has in, you know, the the way we use plastic in such a dominant way for most of the materials in our lives. So if you look at this schema, you'll see the little yellow circle, and that's the Holocene. So the Holocene, as I'll explain, begins about 11,700 years ago. So what is the Holocene? The Holocene, well, it actually began around 11,700 BC, rather. And it's when the tilt of the Earth caused a global shift in weather patterns. In climate terms, the Holocene is the period immediately following the last ice age. And so the glaciers shrank, sea levels rose, and long term weather patterns changed around the world. Warm weather plants died off, leaving less wild plant varieties available. And in Africa, this meant that animals that ate warm weather plants either migrated or began to die off. Humans had to adjust their strategies for procuring food. So they begin to experiment with the plant species that are left, and they begin to kind of change the way that they're moving across the landscape to acquire different types of food. This is culturally significant because this is the period in which human beings start interacting with our world materially in a different way and creating new types of tools for this more strategic interaction. So the Saharan Holocene is where I do a lot of my research. This is the time period that I study. And it's interesting because it is home to some of the earliest human communities that are using tools in this very complex way. And so in the Sahara, we have very early material evidence of human problem solving. And we can see in the archaeological record very long lived, continuous communities. And we can look at things like weapons and tools and see how people change their strategies over time. So even though we know the Sahara as, one of the world's greatest deserts today, the Sahara was not always a desert. The Sahara used to vacillate in between humid periods and arid periods. So between 2.58 million years ago and the beginning of the Holocene around 11,700 BC, according to glacial cycles, the Sahara would, turn green or it would turn brown depending on the levels of ocean, depending on sea levels, and depending on how much humid air was moving across the continent and how that affected rain patterns on the African continent. So during times of glacial growth, the continent was drier, and we call that a browning period. And during times when the glacier shrank, it was greener and moister, and we call those the Sahara's green periods. So around 12,000 BC, right before the beginning of the Holocene, you have the hyperaridity. So the dry period in the Sahara was ending. So during this period, it's very interesting because the intertropical convergence zone, which is a monsoon system that affects rainfall patterns around the Earth's equator, it expanded. And this intertropical convergence zone brought rainfall into the Sahara. This is what's known as the African humid period. And technically, there's been more than one African humid period, but this is the one in which, things really start popping for human beings on the African continent. So when archaeologists refer to the African humid period, we're talking about this point in time. Now, the African humid period is significant for many reasons, but one of which is that around 7,000 BC, pastoralism spreads across the Sahara. So while pastoralism is spreading across the Sahara, this is not the Sahara we know today. So the Sahara has rainfall, it has lakes, it has rivers, there are water systems throughout the Sahara. And really at this time, the Sahara is populated by hunters and fisher folk. So people are really exploiting these water-based resources like fish and animals that live around lakes and streams. So when pastoralism kind of comes into the continent through, we think perhaps the Sinai Peninsula and also through the Mediterranean, pastoralism or cattle pastoralism is combined with hunting and fishing and gathering. So people are practicing a lot of different types of strategies for acquiring their food. And the thing about pastoralism is really good for dealing with patchy, unpredictable environments. So what we see is that starting around 7000 BC, pastoralism spreads thoroughly throughout the continent. Well, excuse me, not throughout the continent, throughout the Saharan region of the continent. It spreads to the rest of the continent later. So as rainfall becomes more unpredictable, and we start to see the subtle changes that are leading to another arid period for the Sahara. Pastoralists were the ones who found ways to survive during times of little to no rainfall. Many pastoralists, they traveled across dry lands that were becoming drier, and these dry lands would leave places on the landscape that had higher water tables or um, had a deep wells or aquifers, and these were known as oases. So pastoralists learned how to travel across the dry lands from oasis to oases. And oases occur in places where there's an abundant source of underground water. So during 6200 BC, there's a cooling spell, and we see that the climate is changing, and the way that people start to respond to the climate is changing. So pastoralism is spreading, and there's a connection between ritual activities surrounding cattle and how people are adapting to their environment. Now, by 4200 BC, the climate in the central Sahara becomes unpredictable. So pastoralists and foragers, they're moving around, and they're adapting to this unpredictability. And they're trying to find reliable food and water, and they're also trying to avoid inclement weather. So pastoralists, they move along these well-established trails and routes that are based on trade and kinship communities. So around 3200 BC, most of the large lakes begin to dry up. People abandon the driest regions, and they're moving into remaining lakes and along the wadis leading to the Nile River. The wadi is just a seasonal waterway that's attached to a larger river system. So back then, the Nile River had a lot of wadis. And those hunter and fisher folk who were all across the Sahara, they're long gone, because those lakes and those rivers where people were actually building their settlements and taking advantage of all the fish and the animals, those are now gone. And so those people have moved into the Nile Valley, into the Sahel, into other places where um, food and water are more abundant. So by 2780 BC, the Sahara had become, a desert. Hunting and fishing is no longer an option. And the only people who are able to kind of move back and forth between those oases are the pastoralists. So they are the ones who kind of had the adaptation to kind of make these dry lands work for them. So by 1000 BC, the major waters connecting to the Nile River have run dry. You can kind of see, if you look closely at the map, places like Wadi Howard and Wadi El Milk, they used to be able to sustain life, but by 1000 BC, even these waterways have become permanently dry. And so the final movement out of the Sahara is sometimes referred to as an exodus, but that could be misleading, because actually people who were in the Sahara were moving back and forth between the Sahara and the Nile River over and over again for trade and for social reasons, for political reasons. So it's misleading to think that everyone left the desert at once and all went into the Nile Valley or into the Sahel. They had been traveling and they had been mobile for a long time. And so it was more of a gradual emptying out of the Sahara. So migrations influence political developments throughout the Nile Valley. There are social mechanisms that kind of enabled a relatively peaceful influx of pastoralists into a new area. So when we look at the way that these pastoralists came into the northern part of the Nile Valley, which is now um, Egypt, they're coming in right around the time of the Nile Valley pre-dynastic and um, right before Dynasty Zero and right before the unification of ancient Egypt. There was some tension there. There was naturally some tension between a very large aggregated population and a population of new people who were steadily moving in with a different life ways. But that tension was kind of worked out in the events that kind of led up to the unification, the first unification of Pharaonic Egypt. To the south in Sudan, it looks like the influx of pastoralists was a little bit more peaceful and it was a little bit smoother. So we see that the pre-Kerma period leading up to the formation of the Kerma state, we see a much smoother kind of integration of Saharan pastoralists kind of moving in and building societies and cultures with the people who'd been living on the river. So the next slide, just to warn you, does have some pictures of evidence of skeletal violence or skeletal evidence of violence. So when bioarchaeologists study skeletons throughout the Sahara and the Nile Valley during this period, the examination of those human remains does not show frequent signs of violence. So in my area, the Middle Nile Valley, we see what appears to be a peaceful integration of Saharan pastoralists. If we were to see something that looked different, for example, cranial fractures, defensive fractures, embedded arrowheads, these signs would tell us that there was a lot of strife when these pastoralists came in and, integrated themselves into these Nile Valley communities. But we don't see these signs in the skeleton. So when these signs are absent, we look to other explanations of how communities, blend or integrate or adopt widespread cultural changes. So the environmental factors that led to major changes in human subsistence and social organization during this period are crucial, in my opinion, to understanding the context of the relationship between people in the Nile Valley and their surrounding world. So, specialized pastoralism in the Sahara relied on these patterns of mobility and social organization that enabled them to kind of integrate themselves into Nile Valley civilization. So, this happened, but it didn't happen with a series of stark wars and a series of, large scale implications of violence. So pastoralists use social networks to avoid catastrophe. They use these networks to kind of tell them about changing weather patterns. They use their networks to spread their herd resources out amongst their kin to avoid potential disaster. These kinship groups also help them fight if they find themselves embroiled in conflict. And in some cases, these kinship networks can prevent violence because knowing that each side in a conflict has, lots and lots of kinfolks that could come to their aid in conflict is kind of a deterrent. And it's an impetus to kind of help people solve intergroup problems through negotiation rather than conflict. And the social ties that bind pastoralists together have always been central to dealing with environmental stress. So instead of, um, pardon me, so instead of pastoralists kind of moving around in random ways, looking for food and water, the reality is that they're very strategic about the pathways that help them move across these landscapes. So when pastoralists move, what they're actually doing is they're moving along their existing social networks, and they're using their relationships and their family bonds to navigate these landscapes, help them move out of harm's way, and help them, kind of, they have socially safe places that they can move to pursue their needs and pursue the resources they need for themselves and for their animals. So currently, across the Sahelian belt, from the northern portions of West Africa all the way over to Ethiopia, modern day African pastoralists have, been faced with conflicts over land and water. It's not that conflict was unknown to pastoralists. Many pastoralist groups in the past and in the historic area were known for not backing down from a fight. When you think of the Nuer, when you think of the Fulani, when you think of the Maasai, these are all pastoralist people who have fierce warrior components to their culture. So it wasn't that conflict was unknown. It's just that the ways that conflict was resolved are sometimes not available to pastoralist people in this post colonial world. The colonization of the African continent changed several major components of African pastoralism. So now you have these groups that are no longer free to move according to shifting weather patterns. They have to deal with political borders. They have to deal with urbanism. Agricultural developments are now too large to be avoided or to be negotiated with. And it's also that the terms of conflict negotiation are now different. You have state laws that are put in place that override traditional systems of reciprocity and restitution. Firearms and the proliferation of firearms across the continent have severely exacerbated these conflicts. So the old ways of attaining peace and working things out don't often fit with modern political systems. And many of these political systems were built with an inherent bias against mobile people and transhuman pastoralism. The first scientific studies of African pastoralism were sponsored by or closely associated with European colonial powers. You know, the deeper issue with understanding pastoralism today and some of the problems that pastoralists face today is that the original text that we have that scientifically explain African pastoralism, are rooted in colonial perspectives. Historical era pastoralists were observed, studied, and described by people who were working for governments, colonial governments, that saw them as obstacles. These observers stressed their own objectivity, called positivism. And so positivism means that they didn't see or acknowledge how their own cultural biases, such as believing that farming and permanent settlements were superior ways of life, skewed their observations. And, these foundational texts that are full of cultural biases and skewed observations have often been inherited by newly liberated African governments as the scientific foundation for policies. So, colonial era prejudices against pastoralists were inherited by newly independent African governments in the 20th century. And while some government sectors in places like Kenya are actively working to reconsider practices that harm herding ecologies, across the continent, this colonial era knowledge informs policies that are biased against pastoralists. So the field of anthropology was too slow to realize that outsider opinions of pastoralists and their interactions with their indigenous environments need to be strongly revised. So we are actually dealing with, when we talk about ecology and how pastoralists interact with their environment, we're dealing with two bodies of knowledge: their emic body of knowledge and the body of knowledge that was created outside of them. So we're dealing with two bodies of knowledge, one of which is decades old, and the other, the indigenous body of knowledge, is millennia old. We are only beginning to understand how far back into the past these adaptations go. And, colonialism broke systems of collective risk management that were literally thousands of years old. And so, in an effort to control mobile pastoralists for their own reasons, European colonial entities discredited some of the most valuable strategies for surviving environmental catastrophes and environmental stress. So, in a sense, they threw the baby out with the bathwater. So, when we look at indigenous strategies of risk mitigation, um, we see that there were certain things that were built into the cultures of these pastoralist people that were, for the purpose of mitigating risk and protecting the benefit, to the benefit of the group, protecting the well-being of the group. So mobility, collective planning, and landscape management, these were all a part of pastoralist cultures, right? You move so that you don't use up too many of the resources in one place. You move to avoid conflict. You move to trade. You move to strengthen your social ties. Collective planning. You meet once or twice or three times a year in large groups to try and figure out territories, to try to settle disputes, to figure out the direction, of your overall society. And landscape management, learning how to live in balance with your environment so that resources aren't overused and so that resources can be renewed. Now, in terms of managing conflict, traditional ways of managing conflict in pastoralist societies include reciprocity, restitution, and multi-group identity and solidarity. The terms of conflict negotiation are now different. So you have state laws that have overwritten traditional systems of reciprocity and restitution. And the old ways of attaining peace and working things out don't often fit with modern political systems, many of which were built with an inherent bias against mobile and transhuman people. People did and do advocate for their household wealth, but there were and are ways to do that were in balance with the need of the larger group. And so now, when you have people who are kind of struggling for survival, all of these indigenous strategies for mitigating risk and managing conflict have been subordinated to new problems and very few new solutions. So these indigenous strategies of risk mitigation, these are how you survive when the world you live in changes beyond your control. So discussion of climate change tends to stress everyone out. But the goal here is to show that people on the African continent have faced very, very extreme environmental changes before. Having a lush and green landscape turn into a desert is kind of an environmental nightmare. But these groups formed cultural ties and they developed a way of life that mitigated the consequences of that disaster. They found a very creative way to survive. And those people who were using that creative way to survive eventually proliferated throughout the African continent. And this is how cattle pastoralism spread. It spread as a creative way to deal rapidly with environmental change and unpredictability. So I think there's a lesson here in how we should think about the environmental changes that we are facing today, not just, as a diaspora, but as a species. We can't really control nature, but there are some things that we can control. We can control our values. We can control our level of understanding. And we can control the way that we organize ourselves. I live in Santa Barbara, and I just spent 3 days locked in my leaking house because an atmospheric river from the Pacific Ocean turned Santa Barbara into a lake. Many people lost their vehicles. Fortunately, we haven't lost any human lives that I know of, but people had to be rescued out of submerged vehicles. I mean, this was kind of as real as it gets. And I was reading a New York Times article about climate change, and it was interesting to see how many people are still either in denial or don't want to talk about it, or get angry when we have to talk about our changing climate on this planet. And I think maybe this anger kind of comes from being taught that civilization, or to be civilized, means that we should have the utmost control over nature and natural resources. The worst part about public discourse on climate change is how large corporations who have refused to really do their part kind of convinced us as individuals that it was up to us, each one of us by ourselves, to confront climate change. So if we all are taught that we have to confront climate change as individuals, it's no wonder that this topic kind of makes people despair and kind of like stuff their fingers in their ears. So I think the conversations, um, and these conversations should include young people on our planet, should focus on what we can control, and we should decolonize our values and go back to those indigenous strategies, re-emphasize reciprocity, restitution, our level of understanding. We should share accurate information with one another, and we should do this for the culture. We should do it collectively, and we should not put this on the shoulders of people as individuals. I think that there are lessons in the African deep past about how we can pull together and confront this collectively. And I think that collectively is how we should move forward. Thank you.
That was superb. Thank you, Dr. Monroe. One of the things that strikes me is that when young, and you referenced young people, I think it's still the case, and you can tell me because you're encountering young people as they're entering university, and you have a sense of what they've been learning throughout their elementary and secondary school careers, there is, for one thing, not an emphasis on how the region of the world that we refer to as Africa is the region that is most often studied in order to discern when the human species was developing certain skills to adapt to its environment. Is that right? That usually that's not emphasized, that Africa is already in some ways the greatest source of knowledge of the deep past of human capability. Do I have that right?
Right. So we're in the process in archaeology of correcting that. But there was this idea that the great cognitive revolution, that art and abstract thought and higher level complex thinking happened in Lascaux cave, in France, only to find out that tens of thousands of years before you have those kind of abstract symbols and things in Europe. You have them in Africa.
Mhm.
And so this is the place where humans really started to develop modern ways of thinking and solving problems and developing, culture and identities. It's not something that happened after the fact. This is something that happened before humans even left the African continent.
Mhm.
And so that narrative is changing, that narrative that, oh, well, humans became humans somewhere else, like they left as anatomically modern humans, but we didn't become psychologically human until later on. We're changing that because now we've got better we've got better resolution in terms of our dates and our chronology. And now we know that human beings were showing evidence of really complicated thought, you know, probably around, 70,000 BC down in southern Africa. So, yes, this is where we learned to solve problems in a human way on the African continent.
So good. It's happened that the change is happening in the academy, and what we need to do is to have this change occur
Well,
earlier on in the educational process as well.
right. And so I think, as an educator, part of it is um, learning how people solved problems in the past gives us insight into our capabilities for solving problems right now. Like,
Hmm.
I don't let students get away with thinking that um, earlier populations were somehow less physically capable than
Hmm.
we are. Because what they survived, like, we are here because of the knowledge that they passed down.
Mm.
What they survived, the type of predators in their landscape don't exist anymore.
Hmm.
So what those people were able to survive and the knowledge that they were able to pass down, to me, is nothing less than astounding.
Mm.
And then when you bring climate change into it, you know um the fact that the world around them was changing, that the vegetation was drying up, the rivers were drying up, the fact that everything they knew was changing and they still found a way to come together and survive. um I think that is not even just worth learning about. I think it's worth celebrating, and I
Mm.
think we should internalize that.
Yes, I mean I took note that you pointed out that these kinship network systems of management, mitigation, and risk are there are millennia old, whereas the disruption of the colonial period and the so-called first world knowledge that was imposed was decades. And we now know that it is highly problematic. I mean, the other thing I think that you brought out and I wanted to ask you about is, again, even in our current discourse and in news media, people who are nomadic, or who are refugees or migrants, they're presented as both the victims, but also as the problems. And perversely, uh, the West, the United States, and Europe is, highlighted as the responsible for this am I Anthropocene?
The Anthropocene, yeah.
Anthropocene, right? The plastic age.
Yeah.
But we also set ourselves up as, the people who are gonna save the world. And you're sort of flipping this on its head and saying that is these people that we're looking at as victims or as problems, they are the founts of knowledge that we can draw upon in order to move forward. Is that?
Yes, I think that is knowledge that needs to be recovered and amplified.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're losing indigenous languages on the African continent. In those languages is knowledge of plants,
Mm-hmm.
insects, seasonality, uh, water, uh, geography, terrain, landscape, minerals. They're languages of people who are in their native environment in Africa. The languages speak volumes about environmental uh, wisdom, knowledge. And so when we lose indigenous African languages, we're actually losing knowledge of how it all works. So I
Mhm.
think, it should be a priority for us to privilege this indigenous knowledge, indigenous environmental knowledge on the continent, recover it, and to make sure that that knowledge is not subordinated to, knowledge that was kind of created with a colonial foundation.
Mhm. It's it's noteworthy to that Kenya, I think you
Mhm.
said, is where their policymakers are rediscovering this old and but still relevant, crucially relevant knowledge. I mean, it's interesting that, and I mentioned this in the introduction. Um, uh, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the Kenyan poet and writer, who refused to, or rather insisted upon, um, writing in his indigenous dialect, as a way of preserving language. Uh, well, why, as you mentioned, that Kenya is changing its policies, and I imagine that is vis-a-vis the Maasai, for instance. What is it that brought about that? Can you say a little bit more about that? What inspired this
Well,
enlightened
well,
view of
well,
what they're
groups
doing?
like the Maasai who are, suffering a horrendous drought right now. There are
Mm-hmm.
some groups that are large enough to kind of make themselves heard. So the Maasai
Mm.
never stopped pushing back.
Mm.
And then you look at kind of there was a self-reflection. So you look at people who study pastoralism archaeologically in Kenya. There were people who kind of looked at that reflection, who kind of reflected on the body of knowledge and said, wait a minute, we are carrying forth colonialist ideas.
Mm-hmm.
So you had from within the scientific community people saying, wait a minute, we really should be listening to pastoralist groups because this knowledge base has been biased against them, in addition to pastoralist groups kind of advocating for themselves. So it's not all, peaches, there's still some challenges there. But I think that's the key for us as scientists coming in from the outside. We have to constantly check the colonial foundations of our discipline. And we have to be ready to use that knowledge to advocate for Indigenous voices and to advocate for people on the continent who have that knowledge and who have never really stopped advocating for themselves. You have to be strong allies in that.
Excellent. And I want to again call attention to the fact that you are working on a webinar that is going to be a resource for teachers to communicate this good knowledge to young people. And we're looking forward to that. And I want to thank you again. This is every time I have an opportunity to engage with you, I learn something profound. And I'm so glad that you're doing the work that you're doing. Thank you, Dr. Monroe.
Thank you for having me, Maura. Thank you.